universal background checks,
What you talking about, Will?
red flag laws,
What the hell did you just say?
an end to the sales of weapons of war,
What the hell is wrong with you people?
and buying those AK-47s and AR-15s back so that they cannot be used against our fellow Americans.
You went full retard, man.
I got a question for all you self-sufficient men and women out there. Are you really gonna let beta male O'Rourke take your guns? Once convicted drunk driver Beta Male O'Rourke wants to make you submit to a background check before you can get government approval for a life-saving personal protection device and confiscate scary black so-called assault rifles. Yep, that's the same guy who penned words like this as a teenager. One day, as I was driving home from work, I noticed two children crossing the street. They were happy to be free from their troubles. This happiness was mine by right. I had earned it in my dreams. As I neared the young ones, I put all my weight on my right foot, keeping the accelerator pedal on the floor until I heard the crashing of the two children on the hood, and then the sharp cry of pain from one of the two. I was so fascinated for a moment that when, after I had stopped my vehicle, I just sat in a daze, sweet visions filling my head. Well, visions of harming innocent people still fill his head as he and his brain-dead buddies seek to criminalize innocent gun owners by making the self-defense equipment they possess illegal. He further wants to add an additional layer of infringement on anybody who wants to purchase a life-saving firearm through the political power play known as the Universal Background Check, also known as H.R. 8. Let's listen as Robert Francis feigns outrage in order to achieve his people control initiative.
Congressman, welcome. Let's start on the shooting. I want to play for our viewers your reaction at a campaign stop last night.
Don't know what the motivation is, do not yet know the firearms that were used or how they acquired them. But we do know this is up. We do know.
Yeah, the rhetoric that we've used, the thoughts and prayers that you just referred to, it has done nothing to stop the epidemic of gun violence.
The epidemic of gun violence.
Once again, there's no such thing as gun violence. People are violent, but not guns. And you can call it an NRA talking point if you want, but the most reasonable thing that will stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. If people didn't believe that, then when they called the cops, they would be sure to tell them to leave their guns at home and arrive on an active shooter scene without their firearms. But they don't do that because everybody knows that you bring a gun to a gunfight if you want to eliminate the bad guy.
The epidemic of gun violence.
And another thing, there is no epidemic. This is all manufactured and contrived. How do we know? Simple math. They say 40,000 people die each year to this beloved and disingenuous euphemism called gun control. We'll just give them that number, even though we know over 60% of that number are suicides. But we'll give them 40,000. 40,000 divided by the population of 327 million times 100 equals 0.012% of the population dying as a result of firearm use. That's 0.1% of the population, guys. Not even close to what any rational person would call an epidemic. And then if you take 60% of the suicides off of that number, you have 0.007. That's 0.007% of the entire population. To call that an epidemic,
the epidemic of gun violence,
is laughable. So the math says Beta and everybody who calls this an epidemic is a fear-mongering, hyperinflating, exacerbating idiot. I'm not saying that. The math says that. So proceed, Beta.
To protect our kids, our families, our fellow Americans in public places, at a Walmart in El Paso where 22 were killed, in Sutherland Springs in a church, 1 or 2 a day all over this country, 100 killed daily in the United States of America. We're averaging about 300 mass shootings a year. No other country comes close. So yes, this is f***ed up. And if we don't call it out for what it is, if we're not able to speak clearly if we're not able to act decisively, then we will continue to have this kind of bloodshed in America. And I cannot accept that. And so we're going to speak as defiantly and as strongly as we can, but we're also going to take action.
Now, pay careful attention to the action he and others want to take, because there's something about these actions that everybody who's watching this video needs to understand. So after you watch this, take a minute and help me combat YouTube censorship by sharing it. So what actions you talking about, Beto?
Universal background checks, red flag laws, and into the sales of weapons of war, and buying those AK-47s and AR-15s back so that they cannot be used against our fellow Americans.
Let's quickly break down the common thread line that runs through each of these actions that Beto wants to take against us. Background checks, red flag laws, banning the sales of weapons of war, whatever that means, and a mandatory buyback program, which is literally a state-sanctioned confiscation. So what's the common theme? What if you don't consent to any of these? What if you want to obtain a gun without a government background check? What if you want one of those weapons of war? What if you don't want to submit to a constitution-trampling red flag law? What if you don't want to give up the guns they want to confiscate? What if you don't submit to a registration? Well, if you don't submit to Beto's actions, Beto reserves the right to have armed agents of the state initiate gun violence against you just because you didn't submit to his made-up anti-natural rights commands. Beto is advocating gun violence on you in a ridiculous and hypocritical attempt to rid America of gun violence. Now, listen to these lies he uses to get people on board with his plan.
So let's talk more about some of those solutions. You made an unusual campaign stop a couple of weeks ago. You went to the red state of Arkansas and you went to a gun show. What did you learn there?
The first person who approached me introduced himself, recognized me, and I said, look, I got to be honest. I'm here because we lose more than 40,000 Americans a year.
Remember, that number is a lie because 60% of those come from suicides.
We've got to find a solution. And he said, I shouldn't be here. If you have a pulse, if you're 18 years old, I sell you the gun. I shouldn't be able to do that. He, at a gun show selling guns, was advocating for universal background checks.
I don't believe one word of that. You're going to tell me that somebody who's a gun retailer who could make a simple transaction without government red tape is saying, I need the government to lay more restrictions on me. My BS meter is pegged all the way to the right.
Where would we be without our safe, familiar American bullshit?
Another father of three says, I own an AR-15. I'm not sure if I agree with your policy on weapons of war, but I've got 3 kids in school and I'm worried about them. And they're afraid to go to school on Monday. We got to do something. Another guy said, I voted for Trump, have an AK-47, but I'd be willing to give it up if it means that we're going to save lives in this country.
Now my BS meter is smoking. Gun owners typically know that giving away personal firearms doesn't make anyone safer. It just ensures that you'll be outgunned by the cops and the criminals. But I repeat myself.
The challenge is so grave. The threat is so great. We can't meet it with half measure or only half the country. We've got to bring in Republicans, gun owners, Democrats, non-gun owners alike into these solutions and save lives, or else be complicit in the continuing carnage that we see throughout America. And I will not be part of that. We're going to be part of the solution.
You hear that? Beto takes it a step further. If you don't submit yourself to his actions, you are complicit in the continuing carnage. In other words, you yourself are involved in the evil actions of vile murderers who use firearms to indiscriminately harm others. Now, listen closely to this because they admit in a roundabout way that a mandatory buyback is a gun confiscation.
So one of the parts of your solution includes mandatory buybacks for so-called assault weapons. The USA Today editorial board argued against that. They said that you are playing into the NRA's hands, and here's what was part of that editorial. The legislation would absolutely be doomed if it included a mandatory buyback provision. Anything smacking of confiscation would breathe life and energy into the not from my cold dead hands crowd, endangering law enforcement and likely putting a full stop to any further gun safety measures. What's your response?
There's a lot of truth to that statement. And in a way, it'd be better if they just attempted to pass these bold laws so that people can see them for the blatant infringements they are. When they take away rights incrementally, people usually don't catch on till past the time to do anything about it.
You know, more than I worry about the politics or the polling, more than I care about what the NRA has to say on this, I care for my kids and this country and people who live in terror every day. People in El Paso, Mexican Americans who say, I feel like I have a target on my back. I'm afraid to go out in public. Kids who thinking about going to school tomorrow, haven't gone through active shooter drills, already know which bookcase they're going to pull down, which window they're going to jump out of. This is not right, and we should not accept it, and we should be honest with ourselves. Universal background checks will help. Ending the sales of weapons of war will help, but if millions of them remain on the streets, they will still be instruments of terror that terrify and terrorize us and take our lives.
But what about?
I'm not going to accept that.
Oh, but what about the kind of real world dynamic that USA Today, the editorial board, is putting in there, that if you go too far, that it'll kill the whole thing?
Basically, what they're saying is, don't rush too far ahead. Don't go too fast. We'll get their guns. We just have to be patient and calculated.
This triangulation, calculation, poll testing every move, that's what got us here in the first place. I listened to those students from Parkland, Florida, March for Our Lives. It came out with a bold plan for peace.
The March Against Our Rights plan is actually not a bold plan for peace. It's a bold plan for their gun violence by state functionaries that they say they don't trust. Makes a whole lot of sense.
That talks about many of the measures I just described, a national gun registry, licensing for every American who owns a firearm.
A national gun registry, licensing for every American who owns a firearm.
National gun registry and gun licensing? Is this guy Adolf's great nephew?
Use that gun for self-protection, to hunt, to collect, to shoot at target practice, but you don't need an AR-15, an AK-47.
But you don't need an AR-15, an AK-47.
That is a weapon of war designed to kill people as efficiently, as effectively, in as great a number as possible. That high-impact, high-velocity round, it distributes its entire kinetic energy in your body and destroys your insides.
Yeah, that's what fast-moving projectiles do when they enter soft tissue. Did you hear that, though? Beto says, you don't need these firearms.
But you don't need an AR-15, an AK-47.
And Daddy Beto knows best, right?
We talked to the surgeons who treated the victims in El Paso. Many of them had been on the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan. They said these are wounds of war.
They said these are wounds of war.
So a wound of war is different from other wounds? This is so stupid. A wound is a wound. And whether you were killed by a .22 round, which is essentially what a .223 or .556 round is, or whether you were killed by a .45 caliber round, dead is dead. Street wound or war wound, it's still a wound. And people like this have no legitimate right to control your choice of the kind of bullet flinger you want to use. Share this video with everybody you know so that they can understand that every action Beto and his buddies are trying to sell us is backed by the threat of government gun violence. And remember, gun violence is their term, not mine. It just shows how hypocritical they are. Stay vigilant, stay prepared, and stand your ground. I'll see you guys in the next heavily censored shadow ban video.